Our speaker today is Vijay Ranganathan. He is Synthesio's Global Lead of Customer Success Practices. And as you can see in the picture, he's also the man who we love to call the man with the best sideburns in all of social media.
Oh, God.
Vijay's been at Synthesio for going on 4 years now? Going on 3 years now. He's worn many hats at Synthesio, and he's been a social and digital strategist running global customer success business processes at Synthesio, syncing across several teams, including customer success, sales, and product. While today, Vijay, you'll be addressing the so what question. If anyone ever does have a chat with Vijay in person, you'll find out that his actual favorite question is who is your audience? So definitely look out for some of that sprinkled into this webinar as well. And with that, and without any further ado, Vijay, why don't you take it over?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, hi everyone. As Adam said, one of my favorite questions is who is your audience? But if you're talking to me, I hope I am. So I hope that's what happens. Yeah, and as Adam said, I've been working with Synthesio for 3 years, and before that, I was a social media manager. I actually wore that hat along with a few other things. And I have been in the shoes of trying to kind of make sense of social data and make it valuable. And you know, a lot of what we put together today is around that idea of you know, the things that I wish I had known when I was doing that job, and sort of a methodology to approach it. So yeah, you know, we might talk a little bit about the types of insights, but really it's about how to approach the social intelligence, you know, and answer that so what question. And also, just before I move on, it seems that there is some construction happening next door. So if you overhear any hammering, apologies. Just let us know in that chat window if you cannot hear me or having trouble hearing me. But again, apologies. But construction happens whether you know, whether we're doing webinars or not. So moving right along. So let's talk about this so what question. So, you know, I usually kind of contextualize this from the perspective of being the person who was on the front lines of working with social media. This is one of my favorite comics, and it reminds me of basically every conversation I had with you know, VPs and directors when they would come to me and, you know, say, oh, you know, I've just heard about this brand new thing called Instagram. This was a few years ago, obviously. How are we using it? Can we use it? And, you know, I would first say, who is your audience? Because that's my favorite question. And then you know, I try to dig into, like, what's the business value, right? And that's the question that keeps coming up. And we're in this stage with social media where we're kind of halfway in between this really initial, like, excitement and where we really understand what's going on, and we can kind of use the data to drive business decision. So one of the things that we're finding is, you see this caption at the bottom. That was a caption associated with this comic. You know, one of the things that is really difficult when we're trying to transform a business into one that's using social as a fun toy into one that really drives ROI and drives business results, is that we need to move beyond this moment where the press conference questions are stupid and try to get to, like, a really important question. So first, like, you know, the context is, and again, I'm just kind of setting some foundations here. So, and a lot of you already know this. People who've been working with social media already know that there's so much data, right? And all of this data is stuff that we can use. And the whole idea of social listening and social intelligence is to dig through that, to kind of organize and sort it into something, you know, digestible and useful, and then take action. And when I was a social media manager, you know, I was getting caught up in the vanity metrics. Like everyone, you know, this was, you know, I started doing a lot of this in 2009, 2010, and vanity metrics were the big thing then. So I'm very well aware of trying to move beyond this is not just a struggle for social media managers, but it's a struggle for businesses as we try to make sure that we're using all this consumer insight. I mean, we're talking about essentially one giant focus group, or you can think of it as billions of tiny focus groups, depending on how you want to look at it, out there just giving us free information, and all we need to do is figure out how to consume it and rationalize it. So the way to make sense of data is, and this is an illustration I saw and instantly, saved the URL for because I loved it so much. This is essentially a data science strategy. And what we're trying to do is we have all of this data we just saw on the last slide, and we're trying to, over time, rationalize it and then eventually take action, be able to know what lever to press in order to drive change, and what changes impact business outcomes. So this is what we're trying to do now as in the entire world. And when we're talking about a social listening tool like Synthesio, what we're doing is we're actually already getting you basically 4 steps of the way there. We're getting you from data to information to knowledge, where you really know that there are links and that there's some vague relationship. You're able to identify one-to-one links as well. And what we're really trying to do is get past to action. So let's talk about it from a different context, which is social maturity curve, or in this case, what we're really looking at is just a hype curve. This is a standard hype curve. You've probably seen it before if you've looked at any of these, like a Gartner report or things like that. This is how people get excited about new things and how it becomes part of a business. And this curve is pretty standard, really. And you can see it for every technology, email, cell phones, et cetera. You start with a lot of excitement, and then things start to fall off, and then you start to put it into the right places in the business. So you'll notice that pit, that kind of valley. You might have, I've heard it called the trough of disillusionment. And I feel like that's such a great Game of Thrones term, the trough of disillusionment. This is really where the so what moment is. This is the question. We're trying to help you move beyond this moment. And in terms of social maturity, this is where a lot of businesses are. And it might not just be businesses. Sometimes we're talking about, the PR and marketing teams have already pushed past this. They already know what they're doing. But when you're on the product side, you don't see how social media connects back to your business and your work on a day-to-day basis. If I'm, a potato chip company, I don't see how social media is going to impact me on a day-to-day basis. But we can help you find that and pull that inside out. And so we can start talking about social maturity in terms of kind of stages along the path, and then try to get to the point of how do you derive business value from it. So I'm going to give you a quick example, a case study that we, as essentially a social listening leader for automotive companies, observed about a year ago. Actually, it's really timely since Volkswagen just released their information about what they're going to do about Volkswagen Dieselgate to help make the customers, basically make a good for the customers. But about a year ago, Dieselgate happened. And if you don't know what that is, that's when Volkswagen was discovered to be cheating on their emissions testing for different things, basically in terms of complying with government standards. So this was a crisis. When it was discovered, all of our auto customers came to us, and they were basically first trying to use our tool to understand how people were talking about Dieselgate. But then they also, as a next step, started to refine what they were doing with regard to Dieselgate. So when it came to day-to-day monitoring, every day, like how are our different products doing, they were already kind of moving up the beyond the so what. But when it came to this kind of very unique type of crisis, they were right at the beginning. They were just trying to understand how to rationalize it. And so even one business can be in many stages of the social maturity curve. And what we discovered, looking at all of these different dashboards that our customers were working with, was that social was a leading indicator. I think if I remember the date correctly, the information came out late on September 17th, I want to say, or maybe September 14th. I can't remember exactly when. And you could already see a huge negative spike that evening on social. And when you're talking about other types of metrics, you're not going to get those until much, much later. But you had social as a leading indicator saying that there's a crisis. And so it's a really good example of both when someone needs to start looking at social for real, for whatever reason, and also how a business, when I'm a Nissan and I'm monitoring my vehicles, I'm already pretty advanced. I know how to do it, but I might not know about how to deal with this particular type of crisis. I need to kind of, as quickly as possible, move beyond just, as we say in the US, throwing spaghetti at the wall and just trying to figure out how to build this into our business process. So that's the so what moment. How do you move beyond it to build it into your business process? So there are these questions that we're all asking, and more, the answer to the first one is yes. Yeah, we're using social listening. And we know vaguely what we're using it for, like, oh, I want to know how this product is doing in that country. So we've got a little bit of that. But the why is really where we're getting stuck. And the why is really important when you're talking about people who own P&L. The why is basically the business case. What is the business case for continuing to do social listening? So I'm going to make that case right now. But before I do, we actually have to figure out how we got here because of all that data that's coming in. So we're all already, a lot of us are already doing this. A lot of us are already doing some level of social listening. Most of us are on social platforms already ourselves and kind of Googling ourselves from time to time. And then what we're realizing is just knowing that information out of context doesn't really tell us anything. So we are turning on this fire hydrant. We are opening up this fire hydrant. We have all of this information gushing out, but we really don't know anything about it. So how we get to the so what moment is to start to make sense of the data. And to make sense of the data, you need to take all of that and start creating some useful insights into it.
Hey, BJ, we actually just got a good question from Julie. She's talking about with the fire hydrant.
Sure.
Does this mean that you need to go in knowing what you want to know, or can the fire hydrant help you learn and understand what you didn't know that you needed to know? And try saying that 5 times fast.
I will not try to say it 5 times fast, but yeah, that's a great question. And it's a little of both, actually. You do need to, you don't need to. It's useful to know what you're trying to look at. If there's so much information out there, knowing what haystacks to look at for the needles are useful. But at the same time, social also does reveal those haystacks that we didn't even know existed. So yeah, you turn on the hydrant, with one mind, and probably earlier on in the curve. So if I just go back here, earlier on in the curve, you know what you're looking at. But as you move along, you can start doing that discovery to reveal new pieces of information. And that's a good question. I think a good example would be we worked with an agency that was doing advertorial content. And advertorial basically working with publishers or blogs to put out content that kind of promotes a brand and helps talk about sort of thought leadership. And Synthesio data actually revealed something really interesting about that. So we were already looking for this agency at how the content was performing, where it was getting performance. So we were looking at something. But we also revealed something new. We saw that there were things that there are places. So we were looking wider at for certain indicators. We realized that there were certain blogs, certain forums where the content was getting promoted even more than those places where the agency was putting in a lot of their budget and energy. So they were going to, publishers X, Y, and Z, but it turned out that blogs A, B, and C were driving the audience to the content in the first place. And so that's an example of kind of a little of both. You know what you're looking at in some ways, but you cast a wide enough net that if you catch something else, you're still gaining some useful insight out of it. Does that make sense? Hopefully Julie can just respond and say if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that worked.
All right. And I mean, that's an example of making sense of data. So you might know what you're looking at, you might not. You might just be casting that wide net somewhere in the middle of the ocean and seeing what comes up. And that's okay. The key is a tool should be able to help you turn it into a useful insight for the business. And that should be like, again, we're really at the beginning, pre-so what? How do we get to so what? And making sense of the data is great. You listen to your customers and your audience, and you might learn something new. So this is an example of, I'm sorry, excuse me. This is an example of, what am I trying to say? This case study that with Ramadan. So Ramadan is happening right now, and we're trying to understand something. Synthesio did a case study for ourselves. We were just trying to understand how people are talking about Ramadan, specifically around food. And it's Ramadan right now, so people are not eating. Muslims around the world are not eating during the day, and we assumed, ourselves, that it must have an impact on the way people talk about it. So we did a case study a year ago looking at a data from a year ago, looking at how people talked about certain types of food. What are they saying about Coca-Cola? What are they saying about junk food? What are they saying about certain things that they eat in the homes, traditional dinners, things like that, during Ramadan, before Ramadan, and after, during Eid, the celebration when they're feasting. So what were they saying? And what we discovered was people were not talking about, like, if you follow the trend line for Coca-Cola, as just an example, the trend line falls off once Ramadan starts. People are not talking about it especially during the day, during Ramadan. But then, as you approach Eid, the conversation starts to spike for Coca-Cola. So we saw that, and we said, okay, why don't we, as another layer of research, try to look at how people were talking about other things, other drinks. So we looked at how people were talking about water. During the summertime, not drinking anything during the summertime has got to be, during the day especially, has got to be something that's, at least on your mind and something you'll post on social media. And indeed, we looked at that, and during Ramadan, conversation about water was higher, much higher, relative to what it normally is in the beverage, in the drinks universe. And then during Eid, essentially the conversation flipped, and Coke rose and water fell. So we discovered something, and if I'm Coca-Cola, so this was just something we were doing as part of our kind of internal research. If I'm Coca-Cola, I now know what they know. And what we were doing with this case study, by the way, was we were looking at also what people were sharing in terms of images. So we knew what they saw and how they felt about it. So what we're realizing is, if I'm Coca-Cola, I'm going to take this insight. I'm going to say, okay, what this means is I want to talk about my water products more during Ramadan as part of the in-home, family meal nighttime experience. But then as we approach Eid, we'll want to switch it to Coca-Cola. People are talking about celebrating. People are sharing more, less kind of, for lack of a better term, wholesome pictures, and more celebratory and excitement pictures during Eid. And so we'd want to push a campaign around potentially Coca-Cola during the Eid celebration, during the feasts, when everyone is celebrating, everyone's happy. So you are linking your brand outcome to a very exploratory research process. So, and this is how you understand what people are saying. And I was just giving an example of how I personally would try to drive that back into a business decision to help push, if I'm Coca-Cola, the product. So I'm going to just talk a little bit more about moving along the data science strategy, because usually where people get caught is at this knowledge step. And that's something that always happens, and we want to push beyond like knowing that people are talking about water or knowing that people are talking about Coca-Cola, and get to the insight, get into the really useful piece of information that can impact the bottom line. And I'm like, just to pause right here, I want to say the reason why this is important is we are investing a lot in as businesses, social media. We're investing a lot in social listening, and we need to make sure that those investments are actually helping serve the bottom line of the business and helping make our work within the business more valuable. So if we're not catching ourselves in that sort of vanity metrics zone, and that's usually where people start, and I know that's where I started. Like one of my coworkers calls it the vortex of vanity, where, for example, you put out a social campaign to get likes, you get the likes, and then you call that a win. But what do the likes do? How do they? What's the insight there? What's the value? So that's that vortex of vanity. What I'm trying to do is push beyond that a little bit. So we're really, really getting into insights that can drive business decisions. So I'm going to talk about the social landscape. You can get a lot of insight out of Synthesio. We've tried to build this platform to essentially give you the types of key KPIs, social KPIs that you have. I repeated key KPIs. Mm-hmm. The KPIs that you need in the social landscape from all of this data that's coming in. We're trying to help you take care of the first 3 or 4 steps of the data science strategy model and get you beyond that. And so you can work on making your decisions. So we've already got this built into Synthesio, and these types of things are really valuable, even if you're just doing an audit and you're just trying to look very high level and make sense of it all. Because then you can start to understand things like that. You've got your social strengths, you've got your social weaknesses, and you know something about it, and you can even trend this over time and see, oh, product sentiment is going down, our social reputation score on services is going up. All of this kind of information can be embedded into your social listening strategy. And now you're focusing on linking your social strategy back to at least something more than just vanity metrics. And that's great. We got social insight. That's awesome. We're happy, right? No, as usual, it's so what? And we don't really have a solution to go beyond that yet. And going back to this Ramadan example, this case study that we did was, that was something that we did for ourselves. We don't have there's no business outcome. We can suggest them, but we don't know that it's serving a business outcome, even if it was for a customer. So what? This is a really important question. So let's talk about the business goals and related metrics and the brand objectives. So this is what we're doing now. Every business is doing this now, whether we realize it or not. Startup, established 200-year-old enterprise. Everyone has business goals, objectives, and there's some traditional metrics that are coming in, traditional insights. So market share, satisfaction, visibility, brand preference. You've got survey data coming in, purchase consideration. You're looking at ad metrics. All of these things are coming in. And you also know what the bottom line is. You know what products are selling. And if I'm a sneaker company and I'm releasing a new sneaker, I know that sales will spike at the beginning and they'll tail off. And what I want to do is build campaigns to minimize the tail off or to delay the tail off as long as possible, or create new ways of excitement around that. That's already known, and we usually use some of these metrics to inform those decisions. And this actually reminds me of an example out in the 90s, back in the day, of a real-world event that happened. And you might have read about this. I saw it on, I think, the Priceonomics blog, where Subaru, they were realizing in the early 90s, early to mid-90s, that their sales were flagging. They were, people were not enthusiastic about the brand. They didn't really have a brand identity, and they were trying to figure out what to do, how to reorient. And this was sort of a moment of existential crisis for Subaru, and they gave their agency a lot of power. Now, this is before social media, so I'm just talking about a process that they took using traditional metrics. The agency looked into it and saw that one of the key core customer sets that wasn't flagging happened to be lesbian women. And what they realized is they could build an owner advocacy campaign, essentially having owners advocate for the brand, while also subtly, and actually more often than not so subtly, advertising directly to lesbian women. What this agency also discovered while they were doing this is that they that the lesbian women who were buying these cars were also a leading indicator of brand preference generally of types of things people want in their cars. So they were actually boosting the brand overall by pulling influencers along. So they were doing an influencer strategy, an influencer advocacy strategy before social. So this took them years, and they had the time to do it. Nowadays, we don't have that kind of time. We have to do things really quickly. We can't wait to get just the traditional metrics and figure out the traditional strengths and weaknesses. Because it could take too long, and especially with the smaller businesses, especially when we're talking about one quarterly earnings report potentially ruining the valuation of a business and then leading it into restructure. That's a huge deal. And what we need to do is move a little faster so we can link the traditional insight to the social insight and then identify differences and, again, those leading indicators. So our companies now, our customers now are doing owner advocacy tracking on a day-to-day basis using the social as a leading indicator. And they're building it into their process. They're saying, okay, what are people doing right now to understand, to promote their brand, and also what are owners saying about their brand they might not like. So essentially, how do we retain the customers? How do we get, I don't know, this potato chip buyer to come back and buy these potato chips, or this car buyer to come back and be a repeat customer? For cars, it's much more of a big decision, but it impacts CPG as well. Am I going to buy the same razors I bought last month? So these kinds of things, the social insight can be a leading indicator and can help highlight things that'll come out later in the traditional insights. So you're really unlocking things. So we're now pushing past so what, from insight into action. We finally got to the so what moment. We can push past it. So we've already talked about this a little bit. I'm just kind of showing you what people are doing already. We have our business objectives, and of course, the bottom line objective, even further to the left, is increase revenue, decrease costs, right? That's always sort of the core objectives of any business, and everything we do is about that. And so that's sort of, if it's not, then usually businesses are trying to reorient, so it is. And then you have individual objectives within those overall goals, more leads, et cetera. They already have KPIs, and these, by the way, a business objective or a KPI could be like, business objective is strengthen the reputation of the brand, and the KPI could, among other things, be like, my VP is happy. Sometimes there's a strong influencer within the company who impacts things for the company. If I'm the person who works for Richard Branson and Richard Branson is unhappy, then the entire Virgin, conglomerate is unhappy. So making Richard Branson happy is a KPI for me if I work for him. So it doesn't always have to be a pure metric, but you then link it to as many metrics as you can, and also link back the happiness in, even explicitly. Hey, Mr. Branson, or I guess it's Sir Branson now. Hey, Sir Branson, I want, this metric is good for the business, so it should make you happy. And then you're linking this, NPS or ad performance to that. So now all we need to do is layer in the social metrics and link it up so that way every business objective has one or multiple social metrics attached to it. And in the case of something like brand visibility, the awareness metric. In the case of something like customer satisfaction, social reputation score. So we have our aligned data, but we haven't still made the action yet. We're really, really close. We've talked about it. Let's kind of start talking about moving beyond the social adolescence. We're kind of maybe 2 steps, or 2 feet away from the so what moment. We realize how we're supposed to do it, but we're not fully integrated yet. And this is good. We're really close. The next step is to build our true business process around powering business decisions. So let me talk about an example here of what that means. We had a customer come to us, a telecom come to us, and say that one of their objectives, they were doing general listening, but one of their objectives was to just improve customer support. That was literally the entire objective. They didn't really have a set of metrics attached to it. They didn't have either offline or online. They just knew that they had a lot of customer support volume. They wanted to reduce it. Again, going back to the bottom line, they wanted to reduce costs. And they also knew that making the customers happy through customer support would be good. So we analyzed things, and we came to realize that, you know, there's lots of ways to measure happiness and unhappiness, but there's also another dimension, which is the influencers. There's a set of people who volunteer to become experts. You know, I know this happens on forums that I participate in. You know, there's certain people who just like, oh, I will answer that question because I have some information. I'm a super user, or I'm an advanced user. I've become an expert. What this telecom did was they said, oh, like, you know, when we gave them this information, we suggested what you should do is leverage them. And they said, well, we have this customer support portal that's semi-public that we're trying to improve usage on. And so what they decided, and kind of we consulted with them on deciding, was to transform their customer support portal not into just a conversation between business and customer, but make it more about customer and customer, expert and customer. So they identified these influencers using Synthesio. They said, okay, we're going to give you a badge, give you a special access to the support portal where you can help triage some of these questions. It's kind of a forum, basically, and be sort of a very, very simple, consultative, high level of customer support. So they were now powering a business decision based on a social observation. So they discovered that, I mean, they knew what they wanted to do, reduce costs in the customer support, make people happier, and they discovered how to do that using these social insights from that hydrant of data that was coming in that they didn't even know existed. So this is sort of my example, my preferred example of how you kind of let it power business decisions. And there's different ways to do it. You know, if you realize a feature is bad, I know that GM just recalled a set of Jeeps because they realized the innovative new shifter that they put into the cars were complicated, hard to use, and made people unhappy. They were empowered to make that business decision, doing a recall, changing the shifters. If you don't empower them, then that's a problem. You'll never be able to actually create this arrow and link this. You know, you'll have the social data coming in, but if nothing can come out of it, then the social data is just a cost. It's not a revenue center. And that's really important. ROI is always really important. So let's transform insights into action. This is the typical process. The example here that I'm using is an example of Nissan Leaf when they released the Leaf in Europe. And I'm just going to walk you through it really quickly. So in terms of where we start with that knowledge. So that's the third step in our data science strategy. And what we're trying to do is understand what's going on, just understand things. So what we realized by using social metrics was that awareness was up. You know, people were talking about it. Share of voice relative to awareness was down, and market share was down. I mean, relative not just to awareness, but also relative to the typical vehicle. And this was a new vehicle, so they expected share of voice to be higher. So, and market share being down, of course, that's the bottom line metric. That's the one that they care about the most. So because of this social discovery, these two pieces of kind of contradictory information, we're able to create a hypothesis with Nissan. We were saying, okay, somewhere along the consideration, top of the funnel, awareness is high. People are seeing and hearing about the Nissan Leaf. Somewhere in between, people are losing interest. So somewhere in the consideration, in the customer journey. So we can use Synthesio to dig into the data, look at it from different angles, and just focus on driving an insight from consideration. And what we can do is, what we would do is say, okay, let's look at every step along the customer journey, right? So we have test drive rates, and we realize that test drive rates is a good indicator when people are going to buy. And when people are buying cars, they need to test drive first. So what they realized was the test drive rates were so much lower than they should have been relative to the awareness and even relative to the share of voice. So that meant if people aren't getting in the cars in the first place, they're never going to, go and buy it. What they also noticed, looking way at the bottom of the purchasing funnel, the customer journey, was that the test drivers actually were buying at slightly higher rates than your typical vehicle buyers. So what that meant was the problem isn't sales, really. The sales process is working fine. The problem, or not the sales process, but selling the car once people see it and compare it to other cars was fine. The problem was getting them to compare it in the first place. So they took an action. Again, they empowered their teams to take action and initiated a test drive campaign. Put the Leaf in front of people so people would be allowed, just try getting in the car and test driving. And it worked. It increased awareness. It increased share of voice. And awareness was already doing okay, but now an increased share of voice and increased market share. And that's an example of turning knowledge into insight into action. And then that action needs to, cycle back. And we look at the knowledge again and see if there's anything new we need to discover from it. And that's the true process that you need to do. So what I would do now, this was a few years ago, what I would do now is, look at range anxiety when it comes to Tesla and when it comes to the Tesla and the new Chevy Bolt, for example. People have range anxiety about that, especially in the US. So this is just sort of your typical process of building insights into action. So then you get to know what you don't know. And knowing what you don't know means you're now building social insight into, on the left, your systems. So you're having it feed into your CRM, so you know who is talking. You're having it feed into your business intelligence tools. So one thing we always recommend through our API is feed it into your business intelligence tool. We have our social reputation score. Link it to your NPS data. Link it to your customer survey data. Start building those correlations, and you can do that. That way you'll get to see those correlations, and when things start to go wildly askew, one goes up while the other goes down, you can try to look into that. And actually, we do have an example of a company, of a customer that's been doing that for the last couple of years, where it's a gaming company, video gaming company, that is pulling our data out, correlating it to other data. They're basically usage data of the customers who are playing the games online, and starting to build a predictive model. And they've used this predictive model where they understand social is a leading indicator of server issues. When a new game comes out or there's something wrong, people talk about it on social before they reach out directly to the company. And sometimes the company doesn't even detect it because they might be low level. So social is a good leading indicator of when server issues come up. And what they've done is, using their business intelligence integration, they're actually able to identify these and reallocate resources before things become a crisis. So now they're actually getting ahead of the crisis. And that's where you're turning what you don't know into knowledge and then into action. So that's one way that they were really able to do that. And then, of course, you're also integrating it across the rest of the business. On the right-hand side, you've got all these different business units that are using it. And knowing what you don't know could then mean something else for them. So, for example, we did an image recognition proof of concept, just looking at how people are talking about Mountain Dew. The drink Mountain Dew, again, this was just part of our kind of looking at random things and trying to see what we could find, again, just to find out what we don't know. And one of the things that we discovered really quickly using this image recognition software and this capability is that, again, linking back to my previous example, video gamers made a lot of reference to Mountain Dew. And this led to a direct outcome where you can just recommend, or this could lead to a direct outcome, where we could recommend to Mountain Dew, if they're a customer, we'd say, all right, gamers are talking about Mountain Dew, and they're also, when they post a picture of the Mountain Dew, because of our image recognition software and we're detecting it, we're also noticing that they're posting pictures of now discontinued products. One of them being, I think, Code Red. And we would make the recommendation to Mountain Dew, re-release it, link it to one of the games. If it's a gaming company, we would make a recommendation to them. Look, everyone is drinking Mountain Dew while they're playing, so why don't you put codes underneath the caps? All of that means that you have to empower the teams, right? You can't just tell this to the person who is building the campaigns. You also need to tell this to the people who are building the product. They could put in product placement within the products, within the games themselves. And then your social insight is using what you don't know to drive correlations and really build a truly mature enterprise where you're beyond so what, where your traditional metrics and your social insights are the same, are blended together, are fully integrated, and you're completely beyond the so what moment because you're using it to drive your business goals. So, I mean, this is basically it. I know that I think we have like about 10 or 15 minutes left. So I think, yeah, I don't have anything else to say. So Adam, I saw a lot of questions.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions coming in. Some of them, you actually already answered throughout.
Awesome.
In your presentation. But here's a great one from, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Monava. Many of the frequently touted stats, such as engagement or reach, don't tell you how many of the social media posts actually lead to true engagement with our brand, such as, in our case, what percentage of tweets lead to our target audience directly using our services. How do you propose we use available metrics to further answer these questions? Do they exist, or should we develop our own metrics and strategy to measure?
Oh, wow, that's do you have more than 15 minutes? No, this is a great question. So, okay, I mean, not knowing a lot about your business, and Monava, was it? Mm-hmm. Or apologies also if I mispronounced your name. Not knowing a lot about your business, I can't give you, a step-by-step process. But what I can say is, you're right. There are things like, actually, I'm going to keep it right here. There are things like awareness where you don't know necessarily who it's reaching. However, what we can do is, and what we would recommend is taking a step back and looking at change over time between customer behavior, those engaged customers that you know are customers. That's kind of bottom of the funnel or end of the customer journey, or near the end of the customer journey. Look at the awareness metrics, and then look in between. Look throughout that process, the consideration process. Look at who the influencers are. Identify a panel. We are able to take panels, for example, with our tool, and look at how they compare to the general public. And essentially, look back and see how things have changed over time, and identify the way those things correlate to each other. So in some ways, the model that you're building is somewhat your own, and that's part of the reason why we really focus on the ecosystem of integrating with other tools. But it's also based on using the metrics that we have. So you would start with all of these social metrics, looking at different audiences. You could slice and dice the audiences different ways. So if you wanted to target, say, only your customers in France, you could totally do that. Look at how they're behaving. Look at how your influencers in France are behaving. The people that you know are important. We could use that panel to compare those two. And then look further on. Maybe you have from your CRM a list of identified customers. See how they're talking about everything and see how much they're mentioning your brand relative to that. And that's just establishing a baseline. So that way you know what the baselines are. And then see, when things move, see how, what things are tied to each other tightly, which things are loosely tied to each other, and see how things move separately. I know I don't feel like this fully answers your question, because I feel like, this is its own 10-page case study on how to build a perfect social intelligence model. But the key is not isolating it to the metrics. And when we do that, we completely lose the focus. And I know, having been a social media manager myself, it's easy to get caught up in that. So the key is, you're asking the right question. The question is, how do I make sure I'm actually delivering value to the customer? And how do I make sure that the things I'm getting from social actually get back to the customers? you do need to build some correlations and understand that, and then dig deeper into that with your ecosystem of tools. And we understand social listening, social intelligence. So what? All of that is a piece of a larger puzzle. What we do also know is that there's so much data here that ignoring it is, basically like sitting in a boat and ignoring the ocean. You can't avoid it, and it's important to start looking and build those correlations. And that would be a process, and we'd work with you. We would say, all right, let's do our category audit, let's research our panels, let's build a panel list together, start building those correlations, and then help you build that model. And of course, that would be like a true engagement. Take a month or two to build that out and understand it. But it's definitely doable, and it's kind of the right question to ask. The next step is trying to figure out how you're going to answer it. That's right for your business.
Great.
I hope that's a good answer.
I think it answered the question. Here's another question from an Andrea. How can agencies utilize the "so what" moment to retain clients and to help clients identify when they get to that "so what" moment?
Oh, okay. That's another good one. Yeah, agencies are in a bit of a different kind of place than brands, and I was focusing on brands. Thanks for pointing that out, Andrea. Agencies, yeah, you're kind of in that place where you need to be able to help them reach that "so what" moment. And my kind of gut reaction, my first reaction to that question is that oftentimes when a business is coming to you, a customer is coming to you, and they want more metrics, and they're asking for more data, and they're asking for you to provide more. What they're indicating, it's sort of like a signal, it's like a baby crying. It's like an indicator that there's something wrong, right? They're grasping for something more, and that is often an indicator of a "so what" moment, where you as an agency would need to move them along and help them along. So like, for example, they're saying, yeah, but I really want more data on this, or this report didn't really help. My VP was unimpressed. One thing I hear a lot from agencies, or what the brands that are talking to agencies is, yeah, wow me. And what they're asking for when they say those things, these are all like signals, and they just don't know what they're saying sometimes, or they don't realize what they're saying. I don't know what to do with this information. I don't know how to make it like actionable, and I don't know if I want to spend that money anymore. So also when things go back to when company goes to compete, or you're feeling that threat, that's another indicator. So those are indicators that there's a "so what" moment. And what an agency can do is start talking about it from the process perspective, from the perspective of, we have all this information, we have this insight, your KPIs are this, and a good agency already knows those core KPIs, and also knows, and just stepping back a little bit, also already knows those business objectives. So what you're trying to do is try to draw that line back and say, you know what? This social reputation score dipping, like we track this related to our campaigns, and we're noticing the social reputation score dipping. We might need to look at customer retention and get ahead of things a little bit. You're helping the customer realize that the social metric is an indicator that can help them make a business decision more quickly. And sometimes it takes a couple events, like saying when they see that the social indicator was a leading indicator, then they'll understand the value, or that social reputation score provides a lot more color on and net promoter score, then they'll understand how much value the social has. But different businesses, even if you're an agency, like a lot of our customers are huge brands, and like I said, not everyone's at the same place in the social maturity curve. Not everyone is at the same point. But But if they're struggling to understand things, if they're asking for more, that's usually a good indicator that they want more. And it's an opportunity for you to say, well, what we would recommend is that product does this or R&D does this. And if it's isolated, and it often is, you can say, well, let's watch this. We predict that things might will get better in this way, or things are going to trend in this direction. You can help them realize the value that social provides. In pushing past this insight, like we know that test drive rates are lower than typical. And if Nissan did nothing with it, they'll know that we had this information ahead of time. And if we're not pushing past it, we're going to get stuck in this loop. It's like that vortex of vanity I talked about, but it's with organic social data, and it doesn't help you get to action. Again, I feel like I didn't fully answer the question because we kind of serve as an agency for a lot of our customers. So we're helping them push beyond this insight moment into action, and that's really the important part.
No, I think that especially as someone who I've also spent a good amount of time at agencies. No, I think you addressed that. We've got a really great question from a Tina. So she asked, it seems like there are a lot of similarities between so what and social ROI. Are there differences, or is this just a different way of saying social ROI?
There are the one main difference I would say is that social ROI, and this is my personal opinion. Social ROI often isolates ourselves to social, right? And I would say, like, if you're looking at a Venn diagram, there's 85% overlap between social ROI and what we're talking about with the so what moment. And that 15% of difference is the fact that we're trying to go a little bit further and say that things are aligned back to the business objective. So yeah, we're talking about ROI from the social perspective, and we're trying to drive ROI using social. But what we're also saying is that there's more data out there. There's all of this stuff that is interacting with each other. And what you want to do is have ROI be the main thing that you care about. You want the ROI to be the main thing. And social is just a piece of that larger ecosystem of data. We believe and we know that social is one of the largest pieces of the ecosystem of data, mainly because we're living in a lucky age where everyone shares everything. And as a former boss of mine once called it, it's the age of extimacy. Like everyone is sharing that stuff. So when we isolate it to social, I feel like we're just not quite there yet. We're so close to fully integrated, where it's a piece of that puzzle, and we're seeing them all as interrelated. So yeah, I mean, if we're not quite there yet, because moving beyond so what takes time. If we're not quite there yet, this is really, really close to a fully integrated model, and we are beyond so what. Yeah, we can talk about social ROI as sort of a one-to-one. Oh, that's a great question, though.
Here we have one. I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
We have a question from you. How would you break down massive mention numbers to actionable insight? So for example, if you only know that there are 500,000 negative mentions on the phrase test drive, how do you bring that number down to the insight level?
Okay, so you know that there's negative insight or negative mentions along the word test drive. So the insight is that's a really good question. So the way to take all of this data, and make it actionable is first, we're going to be doing category audits. We're going to be looking at all of this data that's out there, and try to understand things. But really, when we're trying to figure out things like this, learning what we don't know, there is a little bit of hypothetical and then testing hypotheses with social data. And within a tool, what you can do is structure the dashboards in the case of Synthesio, and this is what we recommend. Structure it such that you're getting all of that extra information and you're using, natural language processing capabilities and other insight capabilities to start slicing and dicing. So sometimes it's hypothetical and exploratory, but one thing that we've noticed is like there are certain things with certain customers where, like, here's an example. Actually, I have an example here that might help. So we had a CPG customer that was trying to understand the audiences that they had around certain fast foods. They didn't really know anything about that, so they just were kind of, I'm sorry, not fast food, low-cost food, supermarket food that you could buy. And they didn't really have any information about the audiences. They didn't have any information about how people were talking about that. So they got millions of mentions of this. And what we helped them do is start looking at things based on influencer rank. So we have our Synthesio rank influencer rating. So they were able to start slicing and dicing based on influence. They were also able to use our demographic filters to understand the different demographic features of the different people who were purchasing the food. So they're just looking at data and using all of the capabilities within the tool to kind of slice and dice and see what happens and start doing some comparisons. So they realize that there's some differences between the way people talk about it in forums versus the way they talk about it on Twitter, things like that. And they also understood something else. They also understood that the way that they're talking about it had a very different conversation shape. And what I mean by that is the types of keywords people were using in their conversations were very, very different. Word frequency analysis that we do in our platform. And the types of words they were using in their profiles were very, very different. So some people were self-identifying as moms. Some people were self-identifying as bloggers. Some people were self-identifying as, conservative or liberal. So we had all of this different kind of information. So then you can say, oh, we're noticing these people who are on Twitter when they're talking about this flavor, they tend to identify as bloggers. So what the outcome became from that was because they were able to use the tool and just, quickly filter and experiment with it, was they realized that there were certain indicators or certain correlations between audiences and the flavor of the product. And so what they did is create custom marketing material where, if you're the person that identifies as a mom and you're also the one that's using the generic flavor or one of the flavors, we're going to start targeting that a little bit more. And the people who are using this, who identified as a video gamer and they were using, the super spicy flavor, they were going to be getting something different in terms of marketing material. So it is the process is pretty much the same as this kind of knowledge hypothesis inside action. But you're always going to be kind of falling back on testing these theories. And sometimes the hypothesis is wrong. There were probably a couple other hypotheses before they got to this. Maybe people had range anxiety, people didn't care. So.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for now. Thank you, VJ. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
And for anyone else who asks any questions, we'll be sure to reach out directly to you and get your questions answered. And we will also have the slides and the presentation available if anyone would like that as well. Thank you all very much for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
And again, thank you very much to VJ.
All right. Have a good one.